Among the pivotal images in American history, few can match the points of light from the bell tower of the Old North Church. That was the signal activating resistance to British occupation in 1775 and soon after the War of Independence. Following last year's strict precautions, that turning point will be commemorated this year with more in person access and an official reopening. To tell us what's planned is the executive director of the Old North Church and Historic Site, Nikki Stewart. Thank you very much for being with us, Nikki.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Nikki, I'm going to have you talk about the past year because we think that historic sites don't have to worry about budgets or bringing people in, but this was a big concern over the past year. How bad was it?
Yeah. So we closed obviously in March of 2020 when everyone closed, and we haven't been open since. We had a 2-week trial last July, and obviously there weren't really people traveling and out and about at that time, and so we are very excited, after 14 months to be able to reopen and welcome people back to the site. Financially, it's been a really huge loss. We've lost about $1.1 million in operating revenue. Folks might think that we are, well heeled with an endowment, but in fact, 95% of our revenue does come from tourism, from ticket sales, school groups, gift shop sales, things like that. So, we've been incredibly lucky to get some government aid from the CARES Act and to have some very generous philanthropic supporters, but we're ready to get our feet back under us now.
Now, of course, I know that business was rough for you, but there's also a trickle down from Old North Church to places, maybe restaurants on Hanover Street.
Yeah, the North End is such a really vibrant and interconnected community. We have ourselves and the Paul Revere House really anchoring the Freedom Trail, but as you mentioned, so many just wonderful restaurants and cafes and local businesses. And it's been really nice to be out, the last few weeks, especially on the weekends, and just seeing the neighborhood really come back to life. It's quite bustling now. The outdoor dining has been set up, so it's a great time to come visit us.
Okay, what's it been like getting the church ready for reopening?
Well, it's like riding a bike. So our staff are back on the bike and ready to go. A good amount of dusting, right, after being closed for 13 months. But our gift shop is well stocked, and we have our info sheets ready for our visitors. When folks visit us, they'll be doing a self-guided tour of the sanctuary, and we're ready. We're ready to go.
Speaking of which, the sanctuary, I didn't hear much about the sanctuary when I was growing up and being, indoctrinated in Boston history, but you've got some interesting features there, including some angels that were sort of lifted from somewhere else.
Yeah, the church is famous for the steeple, right? But there's so much more. We have a 1759 organ, which is just an incredibly beautiful and impressive instrument. The angels that flank it were, the spoils of some privateering, which I'm always quick to say is not piracy. It was legitimate, but they're beautiful pieces of artwork from the 16th century, actually. So even old at the time that they came to Old North. We have a bust of Washington, which on his visit to Boston, Lafayette remarked as being an incredible likeness of Washington. So we have a lot to share. And in non-COVID times, the crypt underneath the church is also open. Unfortunately, the space is so small, we won't be opening it this summer, but in the future, folks will be able to take that tour as well.
And of course, growing up in Boston, I thought of everybody as being no frills Protestant, but these were Anglican congregation here. So the idea of having an ornate interior was not a problem for them.
Right, right. So the church that you see today is restored to what folks in the early 20th century thought that a colonial church would look like. So it's a very, white, light-filled, bright space. But we do have plans to restore the church in time to a more colonial aesthetic. which was very richly colored and decorated. And the congregation at that time was very well off. And so the decor of the church was meant to remind them of how well off they were.
Now, when people growing up in Boston and people even around the country, I'm sure a lot of them know about Paul Revere's ride and the symbolism. But after this past year or so, is there a sort of a different angle on that people might have?
Yeah, I think the last year has been hard for all of us. And at the foundation and at the church, we've really been able to see the parallels between America in 2020 and Boston in the period leading up to the revolution, really as times of uncertainty and times where sacrifice for the community was really essential. I think one of the threads that connects the beginning of the church in 1723 to the colonial period, to Longfellow's poem rallying abolitionists before the Civil War, to today, is that idea of active citizenship, which I think is the notion that we all have to contribute to fulfilling that promise of liberty and justice for all. And we're not there yet, so we still got a lot of work to do.
Now, one of the things that sort of has come to my attention more recently is that right around this time, starting from maybe the Boston Tea Party at the end of 1773, the British government reacted very, very harshly, and I guess that got people in Boston extremely alarmed. I mean, isn't that something that we sort of recapture now that we've been going through the pandemic?
Yeah. I think it's important to remember that we've had struggles before. As you mentioned, the Tea Party was really the culmination of a resistance movement, which stems from the idea that the colonists shouldn't have been taxed without representation. And after the Tea Party, obviously not to be outdone, Parliament enacted the Intolerable Acts, which is great branding, by the way.
Right.
Really puts it out there. But it took away Massachusetts's right to self-govern, and that was a really major step to take, and certainly put all of the colonies on high alert that things were shifting, and that probably a breakup was coming.
Well, what's also interesting here is the involvement of people, the way they mobilize, and that includes, I guess, people who were part of the congregation at Old North Church.
Yeah, the congregation in the colonial time and the time leading up to the revolution was very split. You mentioned earlier we were an Anglican church, and many of our congregants were supportive. And the notion that the colonies would pay taxes to recoup the costs of our defense in the wars of the 1700s, on its face is sensible, right? And I think that's important to remember. The failure was in the implementation, right? So folks in the congregation were very divided. And after the battles at Concord and Lexington, the day after the signals, the congregation actually closed for some time. So it was a period of great divide for Old North.
Look, and one of the other things that's also important here is the way these events played in other colonies, because yes, the British were repressive, but what about the way people around Massachusetts mobilized? Didn't that matter too?
It did. And certainly, I think there are characters, right, to the regions and the colonies, but in some ways, I think that the timing was just either fortunate or unfortunate for us, in that um, the resistance movement and the buildup that led to the Tea Party kind of put us at the head of the line. But certainly the other colonies were watching carefully and thinking about, if things turned a certain way in Massachusetts, the notion that they wouldn't be that far behind. And again, once we lost the right to self-govern, there were strong indicators that, this wouldn't be something that only Massachusetts had to pay the price for.
Well, I know a lot of people have tried to apply these events and figures to more recent things happening in American history, not to mention the Tea Party going back about 11 years ago. But on the other hand, Longfellow, the poet, did this in the middle of the 19th century, and that's also going to be an important part of the observance this week, maybe in virtual fashion, right?
Yes, yes. So Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, is really what catapulted Old North and the steeple signals into, really the icon, I think, of American independence that we are today. And a lot of folks don't realize that Longfellow was very intentional. And he visited Old North and visited the steeple, and the next day began writing this poem. He himself was a very fervent abolitionist, and I think with him we see the power of artists as activists and the power that artists have to inspire social change. And certainly we believe that was Longfellow's intent.
Well, we should mention that people want to connect with this. One way is by maybe coming there for the reopening on Saturday. So what exactly is the schedule for that?
Sure. So we'll be open from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Saturday. And I mentioned earlier, folks will take a self-guided tour through the sanctuary, and our educators will be on site to answer questions and to share, trivia and tidbits and things like that.
And if people want to access the virtual program that includes the Longfellow poem?
Yeah, our event is going to be Sunday night at 7 p.m. And it's an event, actually marking the anniversary of the lantern signals really traces back to the 100th anniversary. This year is the 246th anniversary. And so there's a lot of history there, and the event's going to be held over Zoom. And so if folks want to register, tickets are available at oldnorth.com/lantern 2021.
Well, thank you very much for being with us and taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That was Nikki Stewart from the Old North Church and Historic Site. We'll have more news in just a moment.